Voices Radio.
Voices Radio.
Hello and welcome to I Was Just Wondering with me, Tom Salmon, the show that dives into film, music and games and everything else in between. My guest on this week's show is the co-founder and creative director of Acid Running, Oliver Powe. So for people who aren't familiar with you and your work as a creative director, who are you and what do you do?
Hi Tom, thanks for having me on. My name is Oliver Powe. I'm a creative director and co-founder of Acid Running. So Acid Running is a premium men's running brand based in London, and we launched in April of this year. So it's early days. It's great to be on.
Perfect. Right. So before we jump into all things Acid Running, generally got sort of 4 topics that we're going to kind of cover. And the first topic is the beautiful agony of running. So I'm going to ask a very zen question today. How has running changed your life?
How has running changed my life? Very good question. I suppose in the most obvious way, it's given me my job. So, giving me the chance to have my own running brand has been incredible. And yeah, I think in my personal life, I suppose teaching me the power of self-discipline. Acid running, we like to understand running more as a discipline than a sport. And I'm one of those people who it's something I have to admit, I never actually or very rarely look forward to a run.
Oh, really? Okay.
It's something that I always feel it's something I have to do. And I look forward to the clarity and the feeling after a run, the feeling of accomplishment. And I look forward to those moments on the run where I feel a sense of flow, or I feel like I'm processing something in my mind. But yeah, there's always a sense of slight trepidation before I go out on a run, knowing that there's going to be that discomfort and knowing that it's not going to be over quickly. So from that perspective, running's taught me a huge amount. And I think all runners will understand that feeling of resilience that comes from pushing yourself further and going to that dark place. And you take that into every other aspect of life.
And are you a runner that runs with music or without?
I'm someone who runs without, actually. I like to run on my own and just allow my thoughts to wander. And for me, it's a psychological process predominantly. I like pushing myself physically, and I think you get more psychologically from that. But I feel that if I'm listening to music or if I'm listening to a podcast, then the process becomes a bit more mindless rather than mindful. And I know it's different for everyone. A lot of people kind of scoff at me for that, the fact that I only run with no distractions. But for me, that's how I get the purest experience.
It's the same for me. I don't run with music. For me, it's a meditative exploration, a mental one. I'm exactly the same. I have to process. And also I feel running gives you the opportunity to step away from external stimuli and just be with oneself.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with, is to be kind of completely exposed to themselves and their own thoughts. And when you're running as well, that's a kind of double whammy. You're having to be exposed to kind of your physical limits and also your mental limits at the same time, which is an empowering thing. But to a few people, that can be quite scary.
Yeah. So just following on from that, what's your running routine like at the moment? And do you have an event or distance you're training for?
My running at the moment is quite casual, in the sense that I'm only running every other day at the moment. I'm not doing any big distances, and I'm at a sort of a lull in a nice way, where I'm just letting my body dictate my running. So I'll get up and I'll sort of see how I'm feeling, and I'll either go out and do a short 5K or a 10K. And I'm really enjoying that, actually. There's no pressure, no time pressure, no kind of PB pressure or event pressure. and it's just it feels like really kind of nice leisure running.
Right. And was there a point where you were chasing a time over a particular distance? So like you were trying to get like a 30-minute like 10K or something like that?
Yeah, I don't think I'll ever get a 30-minute 10K, but I did have that. I think when I first got into running, I was quite PB focused, and yeah, I wouldn't say I've sort of grown out of that mentality, but I've definitely kind of moved through that. And I like the sense of running without time pressure or distance pressure. And I think you can kind of have a more honest experience then. And when you listen to your body, you know what your limits are. And I think sometimes I like the idea that I've run PBs and I don't even know it.
Right, yeah.
And there's that sense at the end where you go, wow, that felt quite special. It might be that I didn't run a PB at all, but yeah, the sense of accomplishment from allowing your mind and your body to take you as far as it can is nice without those kind of the framing it within time.
Yeah, and I guess a key part of running is the location. So what are the three biggest things that make running on London's city streets and its urban parks such a special experience for you?
Yeah, I think we're really lucky in London that we have amazing parks to run in. One of my favourite is Richmond Park. I know a few listeners will say, "Oh no, that's not London. That's sorry." But yeah, so amazing places to run, and we're fortunate. It's one of the best cities to run in. But I actually prefer running along busy streets.
Right.
There's something amazing about it in the sense that you're having to concentrate in terms of avoiding pedestrians, in terms of crossing the road, avoiding traffic. And it's that perfect combination of being completely mindful because you're having to concentrate, but also that mindless flow state when you're kind of in that motion state and you feel more relaxed.
And I just wanted to pick up on and some of the promo photos for your first collection. One of your models is next to the Barbican Centre. So, and I guess we'll get into this a bit more, but is there a sense of, do you gravitate towards sort of more brutalist sort of structures rather than say as you say, parks and that kind of thing? You find that more, I guess, more invigorating, I guess.
Yeah, I think for the first collection, there was a real nice synergy between the brutalist architecture around South Bank and the collection. So from a sort of storytelling perspective, the first collection, Voluntary Discomfort, we were really hitting on that message of the suffering involved in running. And I think that the brutalist, austere architecture reflects that really well.
Right.
About focusing on that one outcome and letting the outcome dictate the creation. And just by nature of being based in Waterloo, so we did our first designs in Waterloo. That's where our first office was, and it was a natural reflection of that. Also, the collection from an aesthetic perspective is quite cold in terms of the colour palette. It's quite minimalist. So yeah, that brutalist architecture worked really nicely alongside it.
Okay. So a bit of a two-part question here. What's been your best running experience and what's been your worst?
Best and worst. I mean, there's immediately two that stand out. Yeah, both in the same place, funnily enough. Not at the same time, though. That would have been a bit of a roller coaster. No, so both in the country lanes of Somerset. So I was down in Somerset for a weekend and came down from London on a Friday night, drank too much wine on the Friday night, and on Saturday morning went out for an early pre-breakfast run to sort of sweat out the wine. And went to go for a 10K, felt really good, ended up turning it into a half marathon. And 16 kilometers in, just felt an amazing runner's high with a kind of beautiful view. And I'm someone who doesn't tend to get runner's highs. So for me, that was a real collector's item. And in terms of the worst experience, in the same country lanes a couple of months ago with COVID, I didn't realize at the time I had COVID. I thought I was just under the weather. And I went out for kind of a light 10K and felt poor, didn't feel good at the start, and thought I would just kind of move through it, and got to about 4 or 5k in and thought, wow, I'm really struggling here. And anyone listening who's had COVID will know that feeling of breathlessness and headache. But because I was out in the sticks with no phone and no one nearby, the only real answer was just to run home.
Right.
So I mean, and that required incredible concentration just to try and keep jogging at a low speed, just feeling like that. But so that was probably one of the lower moments of running this year.
I can imagine. So there is a sense of running. There is a sense of fighting with oneself after a certain point of fatigue, where either your body gets tired or your mind sort of gives up. So how are you dealing with getting back to a level of fitness you're used to being after COVID?
I mean, I was very fortunate in terms of I didn't have it badly. It was probably only a week of illness, but over the years of running and doing other conditioning like weight training, that sort of thing, I think you can too often get obsessed. And I touched on it earlier. You can get too obsessed with distances run and times it takes to run the distance, and all that does is put too much pressure on you. Yeah. Fundamentally, if you're going out there and you're having a good run and you're feeling good afterwards, that's the most important thing. And I don't think it actually matters if you're hitting certain fitness levels, because there's so many other variables. Right. And that's the thing about running as a discipline. The discipline element means that even if you go out there and you run a slower time than you did before, it can still be a really fantastic and worthwhile run.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with that. Excuse me. I agree with that 100%. I've had runs where it's been a crawl, but it's been one of the best experiences, because essentially you're out there, you've got your shoes on, you're plodding, off you go, and it's just you by yourself. And as I said, like it's very meditative, and it's a way that I've used to sort of problem solve or process things as well. So I think that's sort of a...
Yeah, and the interesting thing is about that, you saying it's a crawl, is that your definition of a crawl might be someone else's sprint anyway. So these things are all subjective, and I think the most important thing, and this is the thing about acid running that we always kind of focus on, is that the brand is for everyone, right? And the garments are created for everyone. And for us, it's more about you being inspired by the garment to go out there and put yourself in a position of discomfort that you know is going to strengthen you, rather than chasing a certain preset kind of goal or expectations that maybe the sports industry would place on running.
That's an interesting point, actually, because in preparation for this interview, I looked at this running group called Tin Man Elite, and they're sponsored by Adidas, and they are like elite level runners, and they sell apparel. But I'm always slightly put off by wearing a Tin Man Elite branded logo, because the expectation that you put on yourself is to be able to run these fantastic times, and if you're out there in that gear and you're not performing as such, I don't know, is it a sort of psychological thing perhaps? I don't know.
Yeah, I think the word elite has a lot of connotations, and it's something that we would probably tend to avoid. I mean, we produce elite garments, but we frame that in terms of aesthetic, in terms of performance, and in terms of sustainability. Right. We wouldn't frame that in terms of necessarily it being worn by an athlete. And we're going back to that idea that running it's one of the most accessible disciplines you can do. You can just go out there straight out from your door and run. So it doesn't necessarily correlate that it should be an elitist discipline. Yeah, 100%.
So growing up, can you remember the first ever item of sportswear you bought with your own money, and how did it make you feel?
I don't know if there's a sort of a sportswear piece that ever really kind of moved or excited me, and that might be one of the reasons, going back to why we created Acid Running in the first place. I think for me, my love of clothing started with tailoring and streetwear and luxury fashion, right? Before it did sort of sports apparel. And I think for your listeners who are into their fashion, they'll recognize that feeling of when you pick up sports apparel, it just doesn't compare. Right. So it will have that sheen to it that kind of traditional polyester will have. It's sticky when you wear it and you start to sweat. It clings to your body and it smells terribly. Right. So for us, it was about actually creating garments that could solve that problem, something that you could wear outside of running, something you could wear afterwards to the cafe, to the pub, something that wouldn't smell immediately. So for us, it was taking the inspiration actually from outside of sports and bringing it into that performance arena. And so I think maybe having not been inspired by sportswear was the inspiration for launching Acid Running.
And could you just pick out a few brands, perhaps, growing up that you identified more with than, I guess, like luxury brands or streetwear brands?
Yeah, so I think in the streetwear side of things, Stone Island's a brand that's really interested me in the terms of them having that performance element in terms of outerwear, but also having that streetwear side. Arc'teryx are a brand that, I mean, they're a massive hype brand at the moment, but again, starting off from a performance angle. I've always liked some of the more kind of understated brands like APC, Agony. But yeah, I mean, it's I think from my perspective as well, I come from a family where we've got a heritage in the tailoring side. So I've always been interested in the storytelling behind fashion as well. I think tailoring in particular has a storytelling element, and that's something that we wanted to integrate into Acid Running.
So I just want to pick up a little bit about Stone Island, just as a sort of tangent. It was founded by an Italian guy who, based on, I believe you might know this better than I would, who was designing military wear. And there's a follow-on company called CP, which is a lot more utilitarian in its construction, which people aren't so, it's not so known about. And I guess in this country, and maybe you can sort of speak to this a little bit, Stoney has a very particular, I guess, like reputation of like casual movement, like football terraces and things like that. But it gets lost the fact that it actually was military wear first and foremost. I think the guy who was designing it.
Yeah, I mean, we've lost half our audience now by talking about Stone Island, but I think that's any brand that cuts through the noise is always going to have some sort of spin-off in terms of negative or positive reputation. Right. I think a classically English brand would be Burberry. And again, there's similar implications with what Burberry became, let's say, in the 90s. And then also their kind of rebranding to a more international audience, that sort of thing. So all those big brands that have made a real kind of a standing in the scene will always get those implications.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's interesting about the fact that it was kind of military spec, and again, people I suppose don't necessarily know that storyline, but there's kind of that assumed element that it's higher quality because there's been the design element and the performance element that's gone into it.
Mm-hmm. So just taking a break from the sort of clothing angle of our conversation, I just want to jump into topic 2, which is the business of fashion. Now, I understand back in 2013, you graduated from the University of Birmingham with a BSc in political economy, first class honours, and you worked as a political consultant. How did that educational experience and working environment teach you about business and people?
Not a huge amount, I'm going to be honest. So I studied political economy at uni, and it was natural for me to kind of work in that industry afterwards. So I spent a few years as a political consultant in the sort of grubby art of lobbying.
Right.
I mean, without being facetious, I've probably learnt more this week than I did in 3 years of university and 3 years of working in the political sphere.
Yeah.
And I think that's not to say that those are like really intense environments and challenging environments, but I think it's just the amount you're exposed to.
Right.
So, this week we've been dealing with kind of the financial elements of the business, dealing with marketing strategy, dealing with garment design. We're in the middle of a intellectual property dispute with one of the biggest clothing brands in the world. And maybe that we'll do another episode on that. So those are all difficult, daunting things that you're kind of exposed to all the time, and you don't really have a choice rather than to kind of learn and adapt or die. And you can't replicate that in a kind of political sphere.
Right. So just sort of jumping back to that a little bit, you're doing, obviously your passion wasn't in political consulting, I'm assuming at the time, you had different ambitions. But what initially sort of drew you to that particular sort of profession, and then how did you kind of like move away from that while you were, I guess, like in it?
I think maybe growing up I wasn't someone who showed creative potential,
Right.
or creative skills. I wasn't someone who, I'm still not someone who is necessarily good at sort of drawing or that kind of like pure artistic form.
Right.
So it felt natural to me that I would just follow something that I'd shown academic strength and interest in. And I think maybe there was an element of I didn't feel like I was the sort of person who should be in a creative sphere for that reason.
Okay.
So I was a consumer, I was a customer. I loved clothing. I was always interested in fashion. And I kind of go back to that thing. I'm fascinated by storytelling.
Yeah.
And I love the way that kind of fashion is an element of storytelling, and I started to realise that if I'm a storyteller in politics, why couldn't I be a storyteller in fashion?
Right.
And maybe I was kind of surviving by being a storyteller without being an expert there. And I thought, where can I go where that kind of that creative expression is going to be more valuable?
Okay, so how did you make the professional transition from working as a political consultant in 2017 to becoming head buyer at the premium sportswear shop, The Active Collection, in 2019? And was there any backlash from family and friends from this career change?
No, there wasn't any backlash per se. I think there was an element of confusion.
Okay.
People, why would you be leaving a secure profession somewhere where you're having success to go and do something where you have no expertise and background, and is also going to be really tough,
right.
and you're going to have to kind of start from scratch all over again. So yeah, that they were probably nervous for me. I was nervous for myself, but the pull to do it was too strong.
Right.
I couldn't ignore it. And actually, someone said to me a couple of days ago, they were like, I can't think of a time before you doing this.
Right.
And it's weird to think of you in that profession now, which was actually quite nice to hear. So, yeah, I think trepidation, but fundamentally, you, when people are passionate about something, then you just have to support them doing it.
Right. And what do you think gave you that confidence to go like, right, I'm going to put away this stable like career and like jump into the complete unknown?
Good question. Did I have confidence doing it? We have a saying at Acid actually, and it's an old quote, but we've woven it into the website and social media as well. That you've always got sort of two pains to choose from as a human, which is either the pain of self-discipline or the pain of regret.
Right.
And I always think the pain of regret is much fiercer than any other pain. So I knew that if I didn't take that plunge and if I didn't try it, then I would regret it forever.
Okay. And I guess just following on from that question, I guess it relates to what we spoke to sort of previously a little bit before, that you relaunched the London-based luxury brand Powe, which was started by your great-great-grandfather, I believe, in like 1908, and you did that in 2018. So could you briefly go through the major steps you took from day zero, creating a business plan, to buying stock, to relaunching the brand for our listeners, just so they have an idea?
Yeah, I didn't really have a business plan per se. I suppose I just had a sense of the story, not just the story of the brand as it was. So just to give a little bit of background, it was an old tailoring firm started in 1908 in Bishopsgate by my great-grandfather and his two brothers. And they, interesting at talking about Stone Island and military side of things, so they were tailors, and then they served in the First World War. And when they came back from the First World War, they noticed that the boxy suits, people in London tended to wear boxy city suits, and they noticed that the officers' uniforms were a completely different cut and to be more athletic.
Right.
So the military officers' uniforms, and they noticed that they were getting a better response from wives, girlfriends and lovers back home than the traditional city suit.
Right.
So they had the kind of genius idea to replicate that more athletic cut into suit tailoring. And yeah, they grew that business, and it ended up being sold to Burberry in the 70s, and was a sub-label of Burberry until the end of the 90s. So yeah, I didn't have a business plan, but I did have to negotiate a few confusing things, which is there's for heritage brands like that, there are some dubious people who go out and they try and hoover up all the intellectual property. So
right.
hoover up the trademark, the domain names, the Instagram handles. So kind of unpicking all that was quite confusing, and getting the trademark back and that sort of thing. But I kind of just launched into it, and I went head first with the knowledge that I would make mistakes.
Right.
And I just wanted to make those mistakes as quickly as possible to start working out what I really should be doing.
Yeah. And so in terms of that, what were the first sort of items or pieces that you were selling typically?
So it started off with men's silk accessories. So I kind of lent into that tailoring side of things and did, made in England, luxury silk ties and pocket squares.
Right.
I really wanted to start with the first products I designed and created. I wanted them to be kind of the pinnacle of luxury.
Okay.
And I felt that would reflect the brand values really well. And it was also something I felt I could do. I had a sense of what I wanted the ties to be like. And I knew that there was a mill in the north of England that I could use to kind of achieve that world-class level. So it was natural for me to do that. And I ended up pivoting the brand more towards women's wear. So our hero products now are trench coats, cashmere scarves, that sort of thing.
Okay. So why do you think luxury fashion and premium sports are important to the average customer?
I think there's something about luxury fashion that, and it doesn't even have to be real luxury, but something about nice clothing, and nice brands that kind of elevates that consumer experience that nothing else does. So if you look at every other kind of creative industry, be it cinema, music, literature, film, the consumer is always a member of the audience, and they're leaning in and they're watching a story, or they're trying to understand a story in kind of the context of art. And clothing is the only one where you wear it, you're part of that story as well. It's either a story created by the brand or it's a story you create for yourself, but you're the main character and you're the hero of the story. And I just think that's an incredibly powerful thing. So essentially the brand creates something purely for that consumer, and to elevate them. And it's an amazing thing. You can if you're the best dressed person in the room, you're the coolest person in the room. It's as simple as that. And it doesn't matter who's got the most money, the biggest house, the best car, or even the best looking. Right. The best dressed person in the room is the coolest, and we all have access to that. Okay. And I think that's a really powerful thing.
That is interesting. And I always assume fashion, for me, takes a form of like physical architecture. That's the way I sort of think of it, as these sort of pieces are like constructed, and then we're like the shell or whatever that's wearing these pieces of very designed, sort of almost building-esque clothing, I guess, because in terms of like the cut and obviously the proportions of it all sort of feed into that. And it's interesting you talk about like the story, because essentially for me, I'm not, I mean, you can tell the way I'm dressed, I'm not hugely into sort of like luxury fashion, but what intrigues me about like brands like Rick Owens per se is the materials and the fundamental story and the actual aesthetic approach to the creation of those garments. That's what interests me in a sense, rather than somebody's got a Louis belt on in a club and with their t-shirt tucked in so everybody can kind of sort of see it. So there's a sense of sort of peacocking, and then there is a sense of people exploring materials and fashion and figure and form in a more artistic way, shall we say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's interesting about the architecture, as you said, and that's something that's gone in a lot into the design work for Acid Running. Yeah. So again, for us, the classic sportswear silhouette was not something that appealed to us. So we wanted a more relaxed, casual silhouette, something that would replicate what you would see in streetwear or casual wear. And it's just something that's it's a kind of a look that you can place in any other context as well. Right. And it's a kind of it's a positive aesthetic that people look good in, and it's as simple as that as well. We want the garments to perform well, but we want you to look and feel good in them as well.
And there is an element of aspiration to luxury fashion, which I think also is important in a sense, because a lot of times you can look at the expense and maybe the fast fashion nature of it, but it is important to, if you've achieved something, then show your achievement by the clothes that you wear, in a sense. And I guess that does give you a sense of confidence, I should say. So, just in the aftermath of the pandemic, sales of sports equipment and sportswear have exploded. So, Nike, Adidas, and Puma have made record profits. But what's the one major thing major sporting companies get wrong, in your opinion, and how would you go about fixing that?
Good question. Looking at the kind of like big multi sport brands, the like global brands, I don't necessarily look to them as kind of inspiration or competitors, but it's interesting to see something that they and a lot of the big brands have kind of been accused of recently, which is greenwashing.
Yeah.
And I think I'm more shocked by that now, having been in the industry for a few years than before, and the simple reason being that it's not as hard as I think the consumer realizes to weave or improve your sustainability.
Right.
So, my first time doing performance apparel with the first acid running collection, and it was always our goal to be as sustainable as possible. But coming from a kind of a position of humility, we knew that was going to be a massive challenge because we were new, and we were thinking, right, how can we create a framework where we can increase our margins or increase our funding or increase our research so that we can get to a position of like full sustainability.
Right.
But we'll work towards that because we have that element of ignorance where we haven't produced a collection like that before. But I found it easier than I thought to kind of create sustainable garments, more sustainable than most garments you get out there in the market, which for me was shocking. It was essentially just a question of us in many ways spending more on sustainable fabrics, spending more to work with a more sustainable factory. So for that was a real eye-opener in the sense that we weren't closed off from being sustainable by not having huge resources, but people are actively choosing to be unsustainable for tiny profit margins. That obviously they're scaling out on a huge way, but the moral burden is massively on those brands.
And just for the audience, could you just unpack what greenwashing is for them in case they don't know?
Yeah, so I suppose it's a bit of an umbrella term, and I wouldn't say I'm an expert on it, but it's the sense of creating the perspective of sustainability, either where it doesn't exist at all or where it exists in isolated incidents. So what a lot of the big fast fashion brands will do is they'll create a sense of sustainability by working with well-known celebrities who are either kind of sustainably public positioned or talk a lot about sustainability, and to create that sense that they're ethical. And then they'll also create little capsule collections or one-off products which will be sustainable, and they'll really ramp that up with the imagery and the marketing around it, where fundamentally that's tip of the iceberg. And they're not doing that to make their business more sustainable. They're just doing that to create a sense of sustainability or to capture new markets.
So that's the illusion. It's the tip of the spear in a sense. Something draws me to mind was Nike did a collection. I think it was like Tom Sachs, I think the guy's name is. And all his stuff was recycled. All his shoes were basically recycled from bottles, and the soles were like cork and that sort of stuff. And it looks very impressive. But Nike, I think, produces over 6,000, 10,000 shoe models. That's just shoe models in itself, not the amount of shoes that they kind of create. So if you've got a very small proportion of your business that's renewable, but the rest of it is, as you say, like fast fashion and isn't renewable, but for all intents and purposes, you're only going to see what they choose, the very, the tip of the iceberg, what they choose to put out there.
Yeah, and the sad thing is, I think, and we all think of running as a net positive discipline because we know that it's accessible. We know that we can literally just go out of our doors. We don't necessarily even need to travel to run. Yeah. And that sense of positivity that comes through it. So we have a natural bias as runners towards running, but running is incredibly bad for the environment. And so for us as a new running brand, I'd say that's a bigger responsibility for us in many ways than the other incumbents, because we're the ones who are adding more demand and more garments out there. So I think we have to have higher standards than most.
Right. And where do you think that comes from? Because I think this is definitely a generational thing that perhaps if you were doing this 20 years ago, that just wouldn't have been like a consideration. So what made you aware of like sustainability in the first place, and why do you gravitate towards more than that, then obviously huge profit margins.
Yeah, no, I think it's something we've kind of discussed a lot, because I wouldn't say any of us in the team are real evangelists in terms of the environment and sustainability. We're humble in the sense that we don't think we're experts,
right.
And for us, sustainability should be a starting point and should be something achieved for by default.
Right.
I think that, you know, a lot of the kind of bioscience behind it is very complex, and it's something that we're trying to educate ourselves on. But fundamentally, yeah, you know, we've launched a brand in 2022,
yeah,
and what we would hate is to have success and for that to be tinged with regret,
right,
that we've done it in a negative way and we've made the world a worse place. I mean, that wouldn't be much of a success to have built a brand and then to know that we're kind of burdening the environment.
Right. So just to jump into topic 3, acid running, so we can get deep in the weeds here. So essentially, what was that creative spark that made you and your business partners, Alexander and Max, want to start acid running back in 2021? And what were those initial conversations like? Were they very receptive? Was this something that was bubbling away and you're like, well, you have to do this?
Yeah, it was something that was bubbling away in me for a bit. But I think, I mean, the process of getting there, so the three of us worked together with another company we own called the Active Collection, which was an online retailer for luxury running and cycling brands.
Oh, so you owned that? That's one that you owned?
That was the three of us, yeah. Okay. So we were working on that together, and I was responsible for the buying side, so bringing new brands on. And I was a runner, so I had a natural bias towards running.
Yeah.
But cycling was easier in the sense that it was much easier to identify new cycling brands, to identify cycling brands with a really rich brand personality, with a really strong aesthetic, with an edge to them.
Yeah.
And on the running side, I was really struggling. I mean, we found a nice selection of little running brands and we had them on site, but it was genuinely hard work to try and find new running brands.
Yeah.
And we felt that there was something missing. I think from our perspective as runners, we felt that, you know, that there's something incredibly unique about running in the sense that, you know, that there's as much suffering as there is satisfaction, as much pleasure as there is discomfort. There's that amazing duality in running. Mm-hmm. And there was nothing really talking about that. It was all about talking to you as an athlete, or talking to you and only framing it in the sense of the pleasure and the runner's high. Yeah. And we were like, where's that dark edge? Right. And there's this perception outside of running, and it's changed massively, but, you know, the perception of running as being a bit eccentric or whatever. And that's an unfair portrayal, because running's really tough and it's dark, and that gives it an amazing edge, and it's cool. Yeah. So we felt that was missing. So we got to the point where we thought, well, if no one else is going to do it, we're going to have to do it. So we sold the Active Collection to fund the first acid running collection.
Okay, right.
Yeah. So that's how we got there.
And so obviously on your website, the strapline reads for the pursuit of suffering, which is appropriate given how ultra competitive the sportswear industry is. And we've spoken about this like a little bit, but how do you as a company go about creating a competitive edge in the marketplace? And I also want to sort of draw upon another running company that was started in 2015, which is Soar Running, which is founded in Hackney, which is founded by, I think it's an architect or a designer plus runner. Maybe it's an unfair comparison to compare these sort of two things, but how is your competition, or a form of competition against your company, how do you compete against something like that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't really look at competitors too much, really. I think you can get bogged down that. We've got a really strong vision for what acid running is and what we want to do, and any of your listeners will see that immediately when they go on the website. It's an aesthetic that you won't have seen before in running, in terms of that casual silhouette, that street style edge, and that kind of darker imagery. So yeah, I don't think we kind of look in terms of competitive edge and competitors. We just do our own thing, and we do it with conviction. Okay. I think, you know, Soar's a really interesting brand, and I don't think we would see Soar as a competitor. They probably wouldn't see us as a competitor. Right. And that's mainly because, I suppose, of their conviction to performance and elite running. Right. So you'll see maybe at the front of an elite marathon race, you'll see some people wearing Soar. So Soar has been it's a really, really good brand where everything's been designed for reducing every split second from your personal best. And I think they're doing a fantastic job at that.
Yeah.
Our mantra and our approach to running is very different. I mean, as you say, our tagline is for the pursuit of suffering, and theirs would probably be, for the pursuit of PBs. So those are two very different things. Very true, and we would, our garments are world class in terms of the performance elements, but we would willingly sacrifice a split second off your 5K time to make you look better.
Right. Okay, that's fair. So from the point of view of a creative director, can you talk a little bit about the process of designing, testing, and making Collection 001 Voluntary Discomforts running shorts from scratch? Because people may not know what that process is like.
Yeah, so it was a long process because it was our first collection. So took over a year, and it was kind of hard and easy at the same time, in the sense that because we set such high standards, we wanted our first collection to be world class immediately. We wanted it to be luxury. We wanted it to be different to what people had seen before. So that meant there was a high design burden and a high technical burden on the process. But at the same time, because we had a really clear vision, it made that process a lot easier. We were in control of the process. We weren't letting the garments and the fabrics dictate the outcome. We were kind of doing that. So in terms of, for listeners who haven't experienced something like that before, you're kind of looking at it from kind of three main avenues. So looking at it from a fabric perspective, so sourcing fabrics, looking at it from an aesthetic perspective, and we have a specific designer who works on that just to make sure the aesthetic is as kind of as good as it can be, and kind of really striking in terms of having that acid running handwriting all the way through. Yeah. And then from the kind of garment performance perspective, and we have a product developer who works on that, and that's her kind of primary role. And it's kind of a dance between all three, and occasionally there are some compromises on one element, but fundamentally everything came out which sort of ticked all three boxes in a really pleasing way. So you've designed it, you've got your fabrics, you've had a mock-up made. Who gets to put on the shorts for the first time and go for a run in the business? Yeah, so I'm not allowed to do that immediately. So when you have, again, some people know this, but others won't. So when you get your samples back from the factory, you need them to be worn by a specific size model. Okay. So, for example, if we're getting a medium, we would want a medium-sized model to wear that for us. So we share a medium-sized model with Burberry, which is a funny, interesting. Like there's the sort of weird family connection coming back in. But so he comes in and models for us, and at the beginning we're looking at the fit primarily, so how that feels on the model, how that fits. And also the silhouette's really important. Yeah. So we have that first element, and then only then do I get the joy of actually running in the shorts and kind of testing them from a performance perspective, and obviously those additional aesthetic elements and fit elements that come from actually going for a run in the shorts. So how do you relay? Because obviously wearing a piece of like clothing in terms of how we feel is very unique to us and our body. So how do you actually go about relaying any sort of notes you have on a pair of shorts back to the design team? Because it is a very individual experience you're trying to make universal. Yeah, I don't think it's there's no science to it per se. You describe that to the product developer, and the product developer relays that back to the factory, and we talk that through with the factory. And I think, the best way of doing it is just to have that kind of open conversation. And I think the one thing I feel really fortunate about in all of this process is that I'm not burdened necessarily with too much of the kind of technical orthodoxy. Right. I can say this feels X, Y, and Z. And then maybe I'm not always using the right terminology, but I'm going to convey that in the kind of most authentic way possible. And if I see something and I say that looks, and I won't swear on live, but that looks like that, then it goes back to the drawing board. And it's not a question of, it just allows us to be really clear, and we communicate really directly with our factory. We'll just jump on a call and kind of work through it. as a team.
And something I just want to pick up on quickly with you is the mood board. So on your IG, you posted Full Stop by John Latham, who is a British contemporary artist who was born in 1921 and died in 2006. So how does that sort of feed into the brand, and how does that inspire you when you're talking about making these items of clothing?
Yeah, I think, for listeners who go on our Instagram, you'll see quite a bit of abstract art on there. I think it's just a way of telling that full story in a really kind of in a creative, but in like a full way. So that abstract art is inspiration for us in terms of our storytelling around the brand. But also we're looking for synergies and overlaps between what's going on in other creative spheres and what's going on in our own.
Yeah.
I just like that one in particular. I thought it was really powerful. The idea, the kind of contested idea of where things begin and where things end.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting thing about when you're in a run, is that there's that sense that you're halfway through something, or you might be coming to the end of it, but there's also that sense of timelessness that comes when you like enter a flow state, or you're having that really engaging run, where kind of time kind of exits the picture altogether.
And just finally, you're part of a group of young entrepreneurs building and running a business in London in the face of England's biggest cost of living crisis in 40 years. If you had 5 minutes alone with the UK Business Secretary, what would you say to him?
Who is the business secretary?
See, that's the thing. When I wrote this, I left it open-ended because I don't know.
It's new today, surely?
It is, yeah.
Okay. I don't know. But I mean, from that perspective, in terms of young entrepreneurs, young creatives, I'd go knock on the door of the housing minister, because I think that's a worse situation. London needs creatives. London needs entrepreneurs. It's been built on that. Of course, there's finance, there's legal, there's the kind of diplomatic and political side. But fundamentally, what gives London its colour is the creatives and the entrepreneurs. And I think the sad thing is that people are being priced out of being within London and are being moved to the periphery. And everyone who understands like the creative space knows that there's a time lag. When you're creative, it could take you 5 to 15 years to reach a point where you can monetize your creative output. It can take that long to refine your creative output to a point where it's either commercial or it's cut through, or you have an audience for it. But in that time, in terms of the cost of living crisis and the housing crisis, people who are in those creative spheres either can't afford to be within the centre of London, being part of the discussion, or they're having to subsidise their creative energies with another role, and actually all that's going to do is undermine their creativity, because it's literally sapping away from it. So I would say it's one of those things where you won't notice it's gone until it's gone.
Right.
We can't just have a kind of zones 1 and 2 populated by the highest paid people in the country. Yeah. And by kind of international business, there has to be young British entrepreneurs and creatives as part of that culture as well.
And just sort of touching on that, we spoke briefly outside that you'd actually recently moved from Waterloo to Borough. Could you just talk about the benefits of moving to a space which is uniquely your own in terms of the creative side of things?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this briefly before we came on air, which was, I think it's just amazing to have that own creative space. And I think just simple stuff from kind of playing music, or being able to kind of be a little bit louder, having open discussions, not having to kind of frame when and where meetings happen, just be able to kind of discuss things freely and work through things freely. It's just, it's a real luxury.
And you really can't put a price on that. That's something that's not, you can't budget for, that communication and that level of freedom. There is no level of money that you can kind of like spend that gets you that communication. It's sort of an intangible but essential to the business. Yeah,
absolutely, and that's why we try and keep everything as like collaborative and in person as we can.
So I just want to quickly move on to topic 4, which is the future of running. So I want to get you a few sort of hot takes about running and running associated items. So on October the 12th, 2019, Eliud Kipchoge became the first athlete to run a marathon, 26.2 miles in 1 hour and 59 minutes, saying afterwards, "This shows no one is limited." what do you think of achievement of what do you think of an achievement of that magnitude? How does that achievement of that magnitude change the sport of running in your mind?
I don't know if it changes it fundamentally. I mean, it's an incredible achievement, of course, but I do like. I like the expression he used at the end in terms of, no one is limited, because for him, his 1 hour 59 might be for one person just going out and running for 10 minutes consecutively. Yeah. For someone else, it might be going on their first run. For someone else, it might be working through some demons in their head by kind of through running, and kind of for everyone that pinnacle is different. So yeah, I don't think it necessarily changes the face of running at all. I think that's what I love about running, is it's all personal battles, and kind of everything we have is already within us. Okay.
And just following on from that question, there was a lot of controversy around Kipchoge's prototype Nike Vaporfly running shoes after the race. What do you think about technology doping in sports?
So yeah, I mean, from a competitive performance perspective, I think that's just something for the regulators and that side of thing. But for me, if the technology enhances your experience of running, then fantastic. I know you mentioned at the start you find running as a kind of meditative process. If technology can enhance that meditative process, for some people that's listening to music, not for me, but for other people that's listening to music, if you can, use technology to enhance that experience and get to that kind of flow state easier, then fantastic, each to their own.
And I also think that isn't it part of just the development of sports like tennis rackets, swimsuits, that these are the things that make... Because essentially it's the human that's interacting with this object, not the object interacting with the human. So when people talk about the controversy of having these super fast sort of shoes, it's based on the athlete, and Kipchoge is an insane level athlete. So the competitive advantage he gets from that will be different from somebody else. So I'm for like pushing the limits of technology and the human body. I don't necessarily buy this idea of it's technology doping. The only thing where it becomes an issue is when people don't have open access to that technology, where it becomes an elite form of technology where only few people actually have access to it.
Yeah.
So, okay, looking forward to the next 5 to 10 years, what do you think is going to be the biggest game changer in terms of the production of sports fabrics and running apparel?
So I'm hoping the moves towards sustainability. I think that the demand from younger demographics for more sustainable garments is going to hopefully reach the boardrooms of some of these big companies. And I think just fundamentally looking at a kind of a bottom-up design process. So instead of trying to replicate the highest end performance apparel, which almost all of it is unsustainable, people look elsewhere for their inspiration. So for us, it's a question of looking towards other styles and relating them back to running apparel, rather than looking at what Olympic athletes are wearing and watering it down for an everyday runner.
And I just want to throw out a very left field question here. What do you think about running clothing made from algae? Because that's a lot more environmentally friendly than cotton and bamboo. Is that something that you've had any sort of periphery experience with or heard about?
Yeah, it's something we've been looking at, and we've kind of been researching as much as we can around all kind of natural fibres, and yeah, hopefully we'll be kind of right at the kind of the edge of sustainability in the years to come.
And where do you go looking for that kind of advanced tech that's sort of over the horizon that isn't ready available? What sort of places do you kind of like investigate?
So fortunately we work with an incredible fabric mill. Right. So they're really at the cutting edge of technology and research. So we're fortunate enough to have a decent level of insight into these advancements. But yeah, it comes back from that position of just being humble and trying to educate ourselves and seeing what's going on and kind of always be at the bastion of kind of what's the future of running apparel.
Okay, so I think I know what the answer to this one is going to be, but what do you think of Web 3.0 applications and collectibles like AR running apps, NFT trainers, and fitness coins? Do you think that will change the running industry?
What did you think I was going to say?
Well, I think as somebody who doesn't like myself, doesn't like to run with music, I feel it's getting in the way of the purity of the running experience. Having an AR running app that's giving me like a line, or zombies are running at me, or NFT trainers or sweat coins for that matter, just seems to be an obstruction rather than a benefit to me per se.
Yeah, no, and I get that, and I think that whole space of Web3 has incredible potential. Of any technology has potential to do good. I agree in the sense that, for me, a lot of what I've seen so far from clothing brands and in fashion has been fairly underwhelming in terms of NFTs. I don't see the value of an NFT pair of trainers at this stage. For us, if we were going to do something in Web3, then we would want it to really elevate the experience for our runners. We'd want to add something and to really bring them inside of acid running and actually kind of invite them inside and give them something that we couldn't give other consumers. So we're absolutely looking to see what we can do in that space, but we'd want it to be really unique and we'd want it to feel acid running. We wouldn't just do it to jump on the bandwagon.
And finally, what is your dream project if money and time wasn't an object?
I'm going to be sentimental here and say I'd be doing exactly the same thing.
Okay.
If money and time weren't an object, I'd be working on acid running today. Yeah, 100%.
And is there a particular garment, shoe or hat or something that you've got a dream piece of apparel that you're itching to sort of design, but you're not quite there in terms of like technology or design or whatever it is?
Yeah, something I'm really looking forward to doing next year actually is running vests. So to begin with, we designed a collection for ourselves really as kind of style obsessed runners. It was quite straightforward to create something really striking that we knew we'd want to wear. But now that we've got this growing audience of runners who are kind of defining what acid running is and defining where we go, we've got to the stage where even though I don't wear running vests to run, the kind of weight of expectation means that I'm now creating one. So I'm really excited about that, because that will be the first time that we create something where we'll have the audience defining its success rather than our own eye.
And lastly, where can people check out and buy acid running clothing and follow you on social media? So
we're on Instagram at acid running, and then just Google acid running and you'll find our website www.acid-running.com.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, Oliver. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.
Tom.
Thanks.
Tom.
Thanks.